I've been asked to introduce the theme of today's panel, the next panel you're about to hear. It has been said that California is showing the nation that what happens here, and when we invest in our future, we innovate, we embrace the world's most dynamic and diverse workforce. And that as a result of what we heard all day today is a very fast-growing economy. At PG&E, we are engaged in all three of these areas. And that is particularly important because when we do our job right, we help make sure that the rest of California keeps creating jobs, particularly middle-class jobs. We are investing. Our CEO, who is co-chair of the Bay Area Council 21st Century Infrastructure Committee, and couldn't be here today, and sends his wishes. He's chair of that because it's fitting for his role. When he came to PG&E a few years ago, he came to lead a massive upgrade of our infrastructure at a scale that's unprecedented in our industry. We've already invested millions, and we're set to invest billions in everything we do, from replacing gas lines to electric upgrades, all through our California areas. Now, we've got a long way to go. Don't make any bones about that. We still have a long ways to go. But we're focused on all those investments in the years to come. Now, PG&E is innovating. You heard a lot about green tech and clean tech. And we're on our way to the establishment of a smart grid, one that will save money, reduce emissions, make it possible to embrace new ways of using energy, like smart appliances and particularly electric vehicles. At PG&E, we're also the leading solar utility in America. 1 out of every 4 solar rooftops in America is in our service territory. 1 out of every 4. It's pretty remarkable. And we're embracing diversity in a model that's really a model for California, from putting veterans to work to being recognized as one of the most diverse major companies in America. When we talk about investing in a 21st century infrastructure, we know that it's important to include in the same conversations who is going to do that work and how those workers are trained. PG&E is very active in those national conversations that we heard a lot about in earlier panels today. Now, we know that we're not alone, which is why it's my honor to welcome our moderator, Ken McNeely, who's president of AT&T California and co-chair of the 21st Infrastructure Committee, who will lead a discussion among experts on infrastructure and how California is building it. Ken? Take a legs.
Well, good afternoon. Smartphones, smart grid, smart homes. Sometimes I think that those are the only smart things in the room when you start to think about how all of this is so interconnected. We live in a world that's changing, and it's changing so fast. We live in a world today where we answer our television and watch our phone. And if E.T. were to phone home today, he actually might be calling the thermostat. So how do we navigate through this maze of technology, this brand new world? Well, that's what we're here this afternoon to chat a little bit about. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel just to talk about 21st century infrastructure. And my pleasure to introduce first Jonathan Spalter. Jonathan is chairman of Mobile Future, a national coalition of businesses, nonprofit organizations, and individuals advocating for an environment in which innovations in the wireless technology and services are enabled and encouraged. Welcome, Jonathan. Next up, Arno Harris. Arno is CEO of Recurrent Energy, one of North America's leading solar project development companies. Arno is also a member of the Bay Area Council 21st Century Infrastructure Task Force. And Chris King. Chris is Chief Regulatory Officer at Siemens, a nationally recognized authority on energy regulation and competitive energy markets. Chris was instrumental in crafting the Energy Policy Act of 2005 that paved the way for advanced metering initiatives in the U.S. But before we get started with questions for this panel, we have a question for you. Well, let me read your question. There it is. What do you think about the state of 21st century infrastructure in the Bay Area? Are we international leaders? Are we leading nationally but not globally? Are we leading in California but not other U.S. cities? Is the Bay Area falling behind on supporting the 21st century infrastructure? All right, well, why don't we, we'll let that run a little longer, and why don't we give each of our panelists an opportunity to tell us exactly why should we care about 21st century infrastructure?
I'm Jonathan Spalter. It's really terrific to be here. Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you as well to the Bay Area Council for convening us around issues that are deeply, deeply important to, as these graphs show, to our future. We exist at Mobile Future to bring mobile innovators and mobile consumers more purposefully into the policy debates that are going on in our state houses in Sacramento, but also in Washington, D.C., where we're based. As the name of our organization suggests, we are at the interstices of both promoting innovation on the one hand and investment in the other in this incredibly important new amalgam that we are all driving towards, which is our mobile future. We know that our mobile future has to be supported by sound and prudent and progressive policymaking. Policymaking on such issues as making sure that we have streamlined tower siting rules, that we can actually move forward on the elaboration of next generation network infrastructure, and also make a seamless transition to an all IP future. A couple of things that I want to talk about very briefly with you today. This week is actually a crucible week in the evolution of mobile and wireless networks and our experience and benefits that we derive from those networks. And the reason is because this week in Washington, D.C., the most critical input that we can imagine for our mobile future, which is electromagnetic spectrum, is truly at ground zero in a meeting on Thursday before the Federal Communications Commission. This week, the grand architecture of an historic new auction design, which has been years in the making and is about to be a takeoff. And I'm going to use this docket number in GovSpeak. It's docket 12268. Will, I think, be remembered if we get it right and if we thread this needle to be one of the most important catalysts for this next great future of mobile innovation in our country. We're hopeful that this proceeding, which is going to lay down the blueprint and the design principles for this important, what we call incentive auction of spectrum, will elaborate rules that will be pro-consumer, pro-innovation, and above all, pro-competition. We're hopeful that it will. And one of the interesting things that we're going to try to balance in our conversation today is why investment in infrastructure for telecommunications increasingly is important, in fact, for making sure that the other bits of infrastructure that we're going to focus on in our panel today, our energy infrastructure, can also achieve great benefits in the future for our society. We know that smart grid, efficient utilities, and connected home services are bringing extraordinary new opportunities to not only the use of our spectrum, but also the future of our energy infrastructure here in the United States and globally. In fact, wireless sensors that manage temperature, light, and water use allow for smart buildings to generate energy savings that approaches roughly 15% annually. And by 2019, just by the end of this decade, those smart buildings will be home to at least, imagine this, 100 million wireless sensors, all of which will be transiting and using this very important spectrum that we require for its effective use in the future. We know that our energy infrastructure, increasingly as it is, undergirded and supported by more efficient, more robust, and stronger telecommunications infrastructures, are saving significant dollars, not only for our global economic productivity, but for our communities here in California and across the country. The order of $20 billion annually is saved if only 4% reductions are realized by the transition to wireless-enabled smart grids. We also know that if you can imagine this, if each of the 117 million homes in the United States were actually on the smart grid, each would effectively save the fill-up requirement for an 18-wheeler. If you extrapolate that towards the future, the savings are going to be profound and deeply beneficial for our society. I'd say, just in my last point, is just as we here in California, and particularly in the zip codes that we live in this area and the Bay Area Council focuses on, are leading in really exciting ways in mobile innovation. Equally and importantly, we also need in Sacramento and Washington and our state houses across the country to be as visionary, as progressive, and as competitive in the way that we actually conduct our mobile innovation policy. If we do, if we can focus successfully on getting the rules of the road and the design principles right on such mundane but important things as incentive auctions for spectrum, ensuring that more government spectrum is transited for the use of our consumers, of our hospitals, of our schools, of our energy grids, of our public safety networks, we all, I think, will continue to realize the benefits of this mobile future that we've only just begun to realize. And I hope that our conversation today will be able to focus significantly on where we need to draw that balance between innovation and investment on the one hand and the role of government on the other. Thank you very much.
You can actually stay seated. Thanks, Jonathan. Arno, what about solar? Why should we as consumers care?
Well, I think I would set the context of my remarks even broader than that, and I think the opening comments really said it well, that so much of California's success is based on the investments that were made in our infrastructure in the previous decade. And we're at this stage now where I think it's really important that groups like the Bay Area Council are focusing on 21st century infrastructure, because it's all about making the investments today that are going to yield similar scale successes for our state in the future. And I guess I would focus then my comments to start things off on the electric power system more broadly, because I think there's a tremendous amount of change going on in the electric power system. And I guess I would if I could boil it down to one soundbite, it's that we're basically trying to teach a very old grid to do some very new tricks. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we've got this old grid. This old grid would be recognizable to someone in the electric power industry from almost a century ago. The transformers look the same, the wires look the same, the towers look the same, and the design looks the same. We've got centralized power plants that are delivering electricity out to the edge of the grid, where electricity is used either by businesses or by homeowners. And we've come to a place now where we're really trying to do some really important and different things with that grid. It's all about, these days, one of the important things that California is doing is setting some very, very high goals in terms of cleaning up our electric power system and really recognizing the importance of addressing the contribution that electric power generation makes to climate change. And so California set a very ambitious goal of getting to 33% renewables by 2020. Turns out we're well on track to getting there. And in fact, it turns out that with the amazing cost reductions that have happened with wind and solar, the cost of generation is not going to be the issue in cleaning up electric power. The challenge we face is really coming from where we want to go after 2020. California has set yet another ambitious goal, which is to get its carbon emissions down to 80% of 1990 standards or levels by 2050. To get there really means making changes far beyond the 33% renewable standard that we've set today, and really means probably going beyond 50%. To get there, we've really got to rethink about where we invest in the grid and invest in the design of it to make it effectively more flexible. And so flexibility basically allows us to create a grid where you could have very high penetration of renewables, technologies that operate a little differently than the conventional generators we've used in the past. Solar generates when the sun shines, wind generates when the wind blows, but it's technically possible to create a grid that has very high, again, north of 50% of our generation coming from those technologies, with redeployment of the technologies that make up that grid. And just really simply, it boils down to three things. It's all about connecting California more with its neighbors, so that's both transmission, but that's also interconnecting us with markets, regional markets for electricity and for carbon and for other commodities. It's all about adding flexible resources on the grid itself, so things like batteries would be a great example, pump storage, other types of ways of shifting the time frame from when energy is generated to when it's used. It's also about things like faster ramping natural gas generation plants that basically are able to follow the load and move up and down a lot more than the old natural gas plants can today. And then thirdly, it's all about what's going on at the grid edge with things like distributed generation, with things like distributed storage. The grid is no longer a one-directional network. It's one where we see power and services flowing from customers onto the grid and from the grid back to customers. And so there's an infrastructure change that's necessary to make that edge of things more flexible as well. The good news is, if we get it right, if we make the investments in the right places, and we generally have a sense of where we want to go at this point, we get the policy right, we get the market design right, and we get the pieces in the right order, California can achieve an even bigger success than I think it has in the past by creating this grid that really supports an exciting future.
Sure. We'll come back to the issue of policy, but first I would like Chris to talk a little bit about what's Siemens' role in moving from this 20th century technology to 21st century technology.
Okay. So my role is global, so I spend a lot of time out of the country and see what's going on in other countries. And I would bring it back to really two things. And I'll start with the first one, which is competitiveness. And so, I mean, from a Siemens perspective, we're about bringing the best products and technologies we can to the market. But if we look at infrastructure, on your 21st century infrastructure question, where are we and what's the challenge? Competitiveness for California. We did a great job building up the educational system in the 60s. We had a reliable electric grid, reliable telecommunications, and they supported our growth in the economy and the innovation. If you look now, we're falling behind in the new areas as well as those. Singapore, if we look at the number of minutes of electric reliability, the number of minutes of outage on average that an American customer experiences per year, is around 220 minutes, a couple hours a year. In Singapore, it's 4 minutes. And that's not atypical. Look at another example, the internet. We built the internet, we were first. Who's best? Could be Korea, almost 100% broadband penetration. We're at 70%, so somewhat behind. In another area, we've heard a lot about transportation today. Singapore's another example. They are more densely populated than the Bay Area, and yet there's very little congestion actually due to technology. They were the first country to come out with congestion pricing on the roads. So during peak hours, you pay, you have a fast track type of thing, which they actually put in the 70s starting out. And they have very good traffic flow even in those times. So we're behind from a competitive standpoint. We still lead on innovation. And that's sort of the second thing is my children, what is a driver? It's how many have heard of the West Antarctica ice sheet in the last couple of days? So through Silicon Valley innovations and through PG&E's help, I can read my meter right this second, see how much my house is using. Through Nest, I can control my thermostat. Through actually one of our products, I can see how much reduction in carbon emissions that generates as soon as I touch the button. Another Bay Area company tells me how much I'm using. So we lead, Silicon Valley leads in terms of innovation, which is why Siemens came here, bought my software company to come here. But in terms of that infrastructure, that next piece, putting technology and policy together and investing, that's where we have some catching up to do.
Well, the audience seems to agree with you that at least in the Bay Area we're falling behind. I think your suggestion was that we as a nation's falling behind when you look at the world. Arno, what are policies that are keeping the solar industry from moving faster to deploy?
Well, it's kind of hard, given the growth that solar has gone through in the past couple of years, it's kind of hard to say things are slowing us down right now. But I'd say if we look at the big challenges, particularly where California is headed, right now we're coming through achieving the goal set for 33% renewables. The utilities have successfully contracted all the resources they need now pretty much to be able to achieve that. There's still a little bit of some of the munis and public power agencies are still buying a little bit on the edges. But what that means is that companies like Recurrent Energy, other successful solar companies here in the Bay Area who really came here because of the market that California is creating, are beginning to find that the pipeline is slowing down. And so addressing these issues of flexibility that I was talking about earlier are going to be key to kind of sending a signal to industry that there is going to be additional opportunity here in California to encourage the investment on the private side to be made in developing the projects and putting the pieces together to make that future happen.
I see. Jonathan, from your perspective on communications, are there impediments to building out the infrastructure?
I do think that there are impediments. One I mentioned, Ken, that I'd just like to reiterate. We know that the most fundamentally important input for the successful future, not only of our smarter energy grids, but of our telecommunications infrastructure, is electromagnetic spectrum. In the United States, and this is similar in societies and markets around the world, significantly, the vast majority of our spectrum assets are actually held not by consumers, not by our communities, but actually by our federal government. And a lot of those resources are reposed in 2 or 3 federal agencies, the Defense Department key amongst them. At a moment where we all are rapidly marching towards the reality of spectrum crunch, where we've seen in communities, various communities across this country, instances where we are experiencing spectrum capacity, the impacts of which are more than simply having to spend more time staring at the dreaded loading symbol of doom, but will have real and are having impacts in community economic productivity, the advancement of educational opportunities, a range of different things. We need to work in a much more concerted and focused way, collectively, not just in Washington, but across the country, in encouraging the transition of government-held spectrum assets into greater consumer use. That work is underway, but we still have many, many years to go before we can fully realize that promise. That's one important impediment. The good news, though, is that our national infrastructure companies, AT&T amongst them, continue to vote with their collective wallets in the promise and opportunity of our national infrastructure. In fact, it's the telecommunications sector, companies like AT&T and Verizon and others, that haven't been investing more than any other industrial sector in American infrastructure at historic levels, close to $30 billion annually, just last year. And that's one of the reasons why I just have a slight variance with your perspective, Chris. We might be falling behind in certain areas of progress. But when it comes to communications advancement, there is a lot of promise that's being realized. Americans per capita, more than any other citizen on the planet, are using our mobile and wireless platforms for data at a greater rate than any other citizen in the world, including Korea, including Singapore. We also have been, I think, we should pat ourselves on the back for the achievements that we've been realizing in developing and deploying 4G LTE networks at a greater pace, at a greater rate than any other country in the world. These are signals that the next years of opportunity in our telecommunications infrastructure are very promising. But we still need to address, to your question, Ken, the fundamental challenge of getting more spectrum licensed and allocated for commercial use, not just by our consumers, our families, but by our educators, our hospitals, our smart grid operators, and also our public safety professionals.
So it sounds like policymakers carry a big stick in deciding how infrastructure is being deployed. Chris, how would you, what's the argument to policymakers that that the same rules may not apply for 21st century infrastructure that apply to 20th century infrastructure?
Well, I'd come back to what Arna was saying. We built an electrical grid that was built when we had huge central generating stations, and all we had to do was carry electrons out to end users, ratepayers, whatever. And now that's got to become a platform to support multiple technologies, renewable technologies, storage technologies, customers who are actively managing their consumption, pricing coming in from the wholesale markets, and causing responses to those pricing. And also recognizing some of the other value the grid provides. I mean, it's one thing to have a solar panel that is, let's say it's 1 kilowatt. Your refrigerator might be 1 kilowatt, but when it turns on, for a few milliseconds, it jumps up to 2 or 3 kilowatts. So if you were not connected to the grid, you would just blow your whole house system. So just recognizing that and then putting in place the regulatory model to provide cost recovery for that, to clarify the rules around what this new environment looks like.
I might just follow on that, which is just, I think Chris makes a really good point, which is that in a world that has a lot of distributed generation in it, it's a world that actually needs the grid more than ever. It's kind of this point that I think sometimes people miss. They think that distributed generation is about customers being able to leave the grid. And certainly there are going to be some customers who have solar panels and get a little bit of storage and are able to completely meet their own needs. But if you look at the vast majority of businesses, of apartment buildings, of urban centers, there just isn't the rooftop space to be able to allow them to generate all their power to be self-sufficient. And so a distributed future is actually one where, oddly enough, the grid that ties everyone together becomes very important as a way to, again, provide this flexibility that absorbs excess power when a home or a business doesn't need it, but is there to provide that power when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing.
Interesting. Jonathan, I saw a survey recently that said that making a phone call is now the 4th most popular thing one does with their smartphone, and it continues to fall. Is consumer behavior driving some of these infrastructure changes or improvements, and how is policy changing to shape that?
It fundamentally is driving not only the operation of networks, the design of networks, but also the kind of business models that we've really, in a very exciting way, begun to witness just around us. Think of this. Boeing, when we say the word Boeing, we think of an aerospace company. Well, they just recently decided to become an OEM and launch their own phone. It's called Black, because they see profound new opportunities for using wireless infrastructure to deliver services to government markets in a much more secure way. We see companies that had traditionally been very much innovators on the edge of the network actually designing and deploying their own networks. Google, for example, is a wonderful example of the attribution of incredible amounts of CapEx and also innovation to elaborate very, very fast fiber networks in certain cities. We're seeing entirely new entrants in this increasingly, I think, competitive space of American communications that we never could have imagined before. And so it's no surprise that when we think about the fact that our smartphones are no longer phones, but actually the phone function has simply become yet another app in the App Store, that we're seeing enormously new business cases and deployment techniques and uses, including, as we see very, very clearly in the smart grid energy space, the evolution of what we're calling the Internet of Everything, or the Internet of Things, where 50 billion connected devices are meant to be coming online globally over the next 10 or 15 years, if you listen to our neighbor John Chambers at Cisco's projections. This is going to have even more profound shifts and changes in the way that we're actually going to be experiencing the network infrastructure that we've all come to rely on and has become an increasingly indispensable part of our daily lives. Now it's going to become an increasingly indispensable part of just about all of the other forms of animate and inanimate communications between us, objects, and the world.
Sure. I have a question to follow up to that, and this is for either of the panelists. It's a chicken or the egg question. Which comes first? Is it 21st century infrastructure that leads to innovation, or does innovation lead to a 21st century infrastructure, smart networks?
It's policy innovation. No, it's a loop, right? You innovate something here, drive some business model change, some policy change, drive some additional investment, perhaps. And one of the key things I think is learning from what's going on in other places. Germany and Spain have huge amounts of renewables, and one might argue maybe they have a little too much solar and wind too fast, and in fact, in Germany, it's resulted that they've had to turn back on some coal-fired power plants, the way things have evolved. But fundamentally right now, the technology is moving fast, it's changing fast, it's making these opportunities come up that is putting pressure on policymakers. So they're doing their best to respond to these, but it's getting a little bit ahead of them in some cases.
Yeah, I would add on that it's not one or the other. It's a spiral process, right? We're building out. There's got to be the initial policy efforts that kind of set some goals. Business can respond to that. We've seen that in terms of the way that California has rolled out its renewables, sort of baby steps at first, and then bigger and bigger targets. And I think there was a comment on an earlier panel that I think fit really well to this, which is it's not about the plan. It's about having a really robust planning process, and it's making sure that you've got the regulatory process for deciding where we're headed is taking a portfolio approach with regard to technology. So we're not betting on one thing or the other happening. We're really saying this area of technology looks promising. We should make sure that we're taking the steps now to preserve those options. But it needs to be dynamic as well in that, a few years down the road, we're measuring and looking at what's happening on cost, what's happening in terms of capabilities, and how is the whole thing working so that the planning process constantly evolves apace with business innovation. But you got to have both.
There are some real reasons for optimism. In 2010, February, the President of the United States stood at the State of the Union and used the word broadband. For the very first time, a president uttered that word publicly. And he set a moonshot goal for our nation, collectively, for each of us, to achieve 98% access to high-speed broadband networks by the end of this decade. We still have quite a bit of work to climb that, to push that log up the hill. And the tremendous irony, though, is that even as we are innovating in profound ways in this area and other innovation hubs around the country, in mobile and wireless, in energy innovation, we still, at least with regard to our communications policy infrastructure, are living not just in the 20th century world, but in the first half of the 20th century world. The template for our communications policy infrastructure was actually written in the 1930s, and we still use it as the template for guiding how we are conducting our overall view of the evolution of policy in these rapidly innovating markets and with this rapidly innovating technology. It's time, Ken, for that policy template from the 1930s to move itself into the 21st century. It's time for all of our networks to migrate to the internet protocol seamlessly. And I think that if we actually can engage this conversation, not just as a Washington conversation, but as a conversation that equally integrates all of us from so many sectors, not just in communications, but in energy and all of the other sectors in our economy that are increasingly reliant on our wireless infrastructure for the conduct of their work. And we harness the thinking and the innovation of our legislators and regulators in our state capitals, including Sacramento, I think we'll be able to get the job done.
So Jonathan and the others, is this a trickle-down leadership from the federal government, or is it leadership by example from state and local governments up to the feds?
God help us if it's from the federal government down. No, I mean, I think that the federal government has clearly played a role in supporting renewables at a high level with the investment tax credit and production tax credit. Those have been very key. But I think it's really clear when you look at where the innovation's coming from in electric power, it's happening at the state level.
Yeah, You only need to look at what happened today in the Senate, where the energy efficiency bill was failed, and to see that. And of course, we're set up that way with states' rights in energy, and the states are regulating energy at that level. But there are things now. Smart grid is starting to cross borders with standards for communications between meters and devices, for example, or between the internet and devices, which is a universal thing. But I think the market and the technologies are largely sorting themselves out, and to the extent you need policy, particularly in energy, it's really at the state level.
Jonathan, communications?
I think that it has become a fact that from the perspective of more innovative and forward-thinking staffers in the halls of Congress, in the innovation offices in some of our federal agencies, and also with policymaking in our regulatory agencies that concern themselves with communication, and including the White House, they're looking for first-to-market innovation in intellectual leadership and communications policies, not just necessarily within the Beltway, but what's going on in some of the states, including here in California. For example, California, our PUC, our state legislature here, has really been on the forefront of thinking creatively and in innovative ways about such things as privacy issues, the kinds of steps that are being taken to elaborate legislative frameworks in certain areas, not all areas, of communications policies have become beacons in many ways for those in Washington that are looking for better and fresher ideas. And also to see in the whole world of minimally viable product, lean company types of mentality to architecting policy, what's actually working? How are citizens in the states responding to the kinds of policy innovation that we're seeing at times in state houses like our own here in California and in other states? I hope that process will continue, and I also hope that Washington will continue to look outward rather than, as it's been trending, to only look inward to itself.
I think we have time for one last question, and that's this one. In a competitive marketplace, should we look to does regulation have a role in an increasing competitive marketplace? If it does, what's one of the changes that you believe should occur to allow for a more rapid deployment of 21st century infrastructure? Why don't we start with Chris?
I think a good example of that is it's in these network industries in particular that are regulated. So smart meters is an area where California is clearly a leader, rolled out to almost all the consumers in the state. That platform is there now, and companies, innovative Silicon Valley companies, are only starting to take advantage of it now. I think the capabilities and the data that's being provided by that. But the regulator was needed in that case because it's not economical to deploy the infrastructure without the regulator.
Yeah, I would say I think the core idea at the heart of regulation still holds very true. When you look at the electric grid, you've basically got a system where, particularly at the wires level, transmission and distribution, you've got an infrastructure that really presents itself as kind of a natural monopoly. You don't want 6 people running wires down the street. But the kinds of services that are evolving and the kinds of capabilities that are evolving at the grid edge and at the middle of the grid mean that we've really got to shift the way we think about how people pay for and are charged for and participate with that network. And so it's moving from sort of a old-fashioned tariff sort of model to one that's more transactive, and ones where people get to make decisions about how much they want to pay for electricity at what time today if they want to run devices that consume certain amounts. And similarly, they're going to get compensated if they put either energy or services onto the grid that enhance the supply of power or enhance reliability. And I think those kind of changes are going to pose some big challenges because the regulatory system we've got today isn't really set up to do that.
Right. Jonathan?
Perhaps maybe now we can conclude definitively that the third fact, ineluctable fact of life, in addition to death and taxes, is that technology innovation is always going to go faster and be more nimble than policy making. And we've seen that, I think, at our peril as we're looking at continuing the pace of investment in innovation in our next generation networks, our next generation infrastructure, in communications, in energy, and a variety of other infrastructural requirements that we require as citizens. It's time that our regulators, our policymakers, and our colleagues in the both administrative and legislative branches recognize this as well, show a little more humility in the conduct of their thinking about regulation, and realize that regulation at its best shouldn't be about solutions searching for problems that haven't yet happened, but rather having recourse and using the enforcement and the anti-competitive and the antitrust infrastructure we already have in spades in many parts of our regulatory community, including the FCC, allowing the market to evolve, allowing consumers to drive the evolution of that marketplace, and use those enforcement mechanisms to right what is wrong, rather than anticipating problems, regulating against them in a status quo ante basis, and trying to shape future market outcomes. A little more humility, a little less crystal ball gazing.
And on that note, we will end. There's been huge progress in innovation and technology over the last 10 years. Over the next few years, perhaps on this panel, we'll serve as holograms instead of having to sit here in person. But thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. Jonathan, Arno, Chris, thank you.
Thank you.